All right, let's dive in. Imagine you're a U.S. Marine sent to keep the peace in a city once called the Paris of the Middle East. But that city is now shattered by violence. Car bombs, assassinations, militias clashing on every corner.
That's Beirut in 1983.
And that's exactly where we're headed today. We're going deep into this tumultuous period using Target Beirut.
By Jack Carr and James M. Scott.
It's a gripping look at the Marines.
The escalating dangers they face.
How their mission went from peacekeeping to something way more perilous.
And finally, the tragedy of October 23rd.
The book doesn't waste any time. It drops you right into the chaos before the Marines even arrive.
The American embassy is attacked.
Not just any attack either.
A suicide bomber
In a delivery van.
breaches the front gate and detonates. It shook the very foundation of America's presence in Beirut.
The book really brings this to life. Ambassador Dillon called it.
A suicide mission.
The target was Robert Ames.
A top CIA expert on the Middle East. He even briefed President Reagan.
What's chilling is Ames had actually been worried about the embassy's security.
Before the attack.
He predicted its vulnerability.
That bombing was a stark warning. It showed the level of fanaticism the U.S. was up against. Even heavily fortified places were at risk.
And yet, despite this,
The Marines were still sent in.
so in May 1983, Colonel Garrity and his Marines landed in Beirut. It's hard to imagine the contrast.
They arrived on ships,
Full of idealism,
ready for a peacekeeping mission.
only to step into a city in the middle of a brutal civil war.
The book captures that dissonance perfectly. The Marines' initial optimism, their belief in restoring order. It's shattered by the reality of Beirut.
The constant threat of violence.
Militias controlling the streets.
This feeling that anything could explode at any moment.
It was so far from what they expected.
And to make things worse, their rules of engagement were incredibly restrictive.
They couldn't even chamber around without a direct order,
From a commissioned officer.
or if they were in immediate danger.
The book mentions a sign the Marines put up.
The Can't Shoot Back Saloon,
Bleakly humorous.
reflecting their frustration.
It shows the impossible situation they were in. Stuck in a highly dangerous environment.
With their hands tied.
And this was all before things really spiraled out of control.
All of this was happening while the May 17th peace agreement was supposed to be helping foreign forces withdraw from Lebanon.
But the agreement started to unravel almost immediately.
And it wasn't just a breakdown. It was an escalation.
The violence got so much worse as different factions fought for power,
The Marines were caught in the crossfire.
witnessing the horrors of the Civil War firsthand.
The book shares some really poignant parts of letters the Marines sent home.
One says, "It's a weird feeling just standing there watching people kill each other.
Mm.
I hate this place with a passion.
They were seeing civilian casualties.
Buildings being bombed.
The sheer brutality of the conflict.
It was so far from their peacekeeping mandate."
Meanwhile, back in Washington, there was a heated debate within the administration. People like McFarlane were pushing for more U.S. intervention. They were convinced American military might was the only way to stabilize things.
But then you had people like Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, urging caution. He was afraid the U.S. would get dragged into an unwinnable quagmire,
It was like they were standing on a fault line. Everyone could feel the tremors,
knowing something big was about to happen.
but unsure of just how big the earthquake would be.
And that's exactly where we're headed next.
Target Beirut dives into the events that turned the Marines' mission from peacekeeping.
Into something far more dangerous.
Things in Beirut came to a head in September 1983. That's when the U.S. made a decision, authorized the use of American naval gunfire.
To support the Lebanese army.
And this is where things really change. Target Beirut quotes Colonel Garrity. He says about this decision.
I gave the orders, but in doing so, we ended our peacekeeping mission. We also opened ourselves up to who knows what kind of payback.
It was a huge shift. By using American firepower, even in support of the Lebanese army, the U.S. crossed a line. They weren't neutral peacekeepers anymore.
They were active participants in the conflict.
The book makes it clear that this had big consequences.
It happened right when the Iranian Revolutionary Guards arrived.
And Hezbollah's influence was growing.
Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. These groups brought a whole new level of fanaticism to an already volatile situation. They weren't like the other militias. They were committed to getting the U.S. out of Lebanon, no matter what the cost.
And that cost started to become tragically clear. In the weeks leading up to October 23rd, the book talks about a big increase in sniper attacks.
Targeting the Marines.
The book doesn't shy away from the personal stories of the Marines killed Seufert Olervalle and Clark.
It reminds us that these weren't just numbers.
They were young men with families, hopes, and dreams.
All cut short.
It's incredibly moving. And there was this growing unease, not just among the Marines, but also their families back home. There's a quote from a Marine's letter that stuck with me. "This whole thing is crazy. I will never trust my government again. So much has happened here that hasn't been reported. It's incredible."
It shows this disconnect between what was happening in Beirut and what was coming out of Washington.
The Marines felt isolated, exposed.
As tensions got worse and worse.
The stage was set for the catastrophic attack on October 23rd.
Target Beirut gives a really harrowing account of that morning. It's like you're right there with the Marines. A yellow Mercedes truck packed with explosives crashes through the barbed wire perimeter,
Barrels right through those flimsy barricades.
past the guard posts.
One Marine even described the driver.
He had this chilling, crazy smile on his face, a
Yeah.
strange silence.
Before everything explodes,
The book says the blast was like
more than 12,000 tons of TNT.
the 4-story building where the battalion landing team was headquartered.
Completely gone.
What's so powerful about how the book tells it is that it captures what each Marine went through.
The chaotic scramble to find survivors.
Digging through the rubble with their bare hands.
What are horrific injuries.
One rescuer said something that sent shivers down my spine. "I saw one man blown in half. I didn't know that could happen to a human body."
It really shows you the brutality of the attack. And the aftermath had huge consequences, far beyond Beirut.
The book really captures the physical and emotional toll on the Marines.
The families back home waiting for news.
And the intense political fallout in the U.S.
It's all woven into the book's powerful narrative.
Target Beirut isn't just about what happened that day. It looks at the lasting impact, makes you think about the complexities of this event and its significance.
So we've reached this turning point, this catastrophic attack. What happens next? How does the book show the immediate aftermath and the long-term consequences?
It takes us through those first few moments.
The rescue and recovery efforts.
The investigations that try to understand what went wrong.
It also examines the bigger picture.
The political decisions.
The rise of new threats.
And ultimately the legacy of Beirut, 1983.
Speaking of legacy, why is it so important for us to understand this event today? What makes it resonate decades later?
What's fascinating is how Beirut 1983 still resonates with us. It was a turning point for the U.S.
It showed us a new kind of enemy, a new kind of warfare.
We had to face how we balance using military force with diplomacy.
How we keep our troops safe.
And how we define victory against terrorism.
So it's not just history. It's a story with echoes in conflicts all over the world, even now.
Exactly. And Target Beirut doesn't just tell the story, it challenges you to think critically about what conflict costs us as humans.
The complexity of peacekeeping.
And how we react to terrorism.
The book sounds really powerful. But before we get into the aftermath and investigation, I want to go back for a minute and talk more about Hezbollah. You mentioned how their influence was growing in Lebanon during this time. Can you tell us more about where they came from and what they were doing in this conflict?
Of course, Hezbollah, which means Party of God, emerged in the early 1980s.
In response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon.
Their ideology is based in Shia Islam.
And they were determined to get foreign powers out of Lebanon.
They had support from Iran, both financial and training.
So they were relatively new, but they quickly became a major player. How were their tactics and goals different from the other militias in Beirut?
Hezbollah had a level of organization and commitment that made them different.
They weren't just fighting for territory or power.
They were driven by a deep ideology.
Their tactics often involved suicide bombings.
And other kinds of asymmetric warfare.
Which was really hard for conventional forces like the U.S. Marines to deal with.
That's a key point.
The U.S. was basically facing an enemy that didn't play by the same rules. An enemy willing to sacrifice everything to get what they wanted.
Exactly. It was a whole new kind of warfare. And the U.S. military was still figuring out how to respond to this new threat.
So the Marines in Beirut were stuck in this incredibly complex and dangerous situation.
Facing an enemy unlike any they'd seen before.
And it's with this backdrop that the events of October 23rd unfold.
Right.
Let's go back to that fateful morning and explore what happened immediately after the bombing. The rescue efforts and the investigations that followed. It was pure chaos right after the bombing. The book really paints this picture. You know, dust and smoke everywhere.
Yeah.
Rescuers desperately looking for anyone alive in the rubble. The wounded being rushed to the USS Iwo Jima.
That Navy ship stationed offshore.
And amidst all that chaos, the Iwo Jima's medical team was amazingly prepared.
They'd actually anticipated a mass casualty event.
They had stockpiled supplies.
They even practiced converting the hangar bay into a triage center. It's a chilling thought.
But it shows the constant danger they were in.
And their preparation definitely saved lives. The book talks about the doctors and nurses working non-stop, treating all sorts of horrific injuries. Broken bones, burns, crush injuries, head wounds.
But beyond just the sheer scale of it all, the book highlights these incredible stories of survival and resilience.
Chaplain Danny Wheeler's story really stands out.
He was trapped under the rubble for hours.
Pinned down by a concrete wall.
The book talks about how harrowing it was. He thought he was going to die.
But then just as the pressure from the wall got to be too much,
The rescuers found him.
he was the last survivor pulled out of that wreckage.
It really shows you the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of something so awful.
Sadly, not everyone was as lucky as Chaplain Wheeler.
The book doesn't shy away from the devastating losses.
241 American servicemen died.
Target Beirut takes us through the whole grim process, identifying the remains, notifying the families, bringing those fallen Marines home. It's a really moving and heartbreaking part of the book.
And back in the U.S., the political fallout was intense.
President Reagan was under so much pressure to respond,
To hold someone accountable.
to explain why the Marines were still in Beirut in the first place.
The book goes into the debates within the administration.
Some people, like Secretary of State Schultz, wanted a strong military response.
Against whoever was responsible, probably Iran or groups they supported.
But then you had others like Defense Secretary Weinberger who wanted restraint.
They were worried about making the conflict worse.
Reagan ultimately decided not to retaliate directly. He did order the Marines to redeploy,
Back to the ships offshore.
but he insisted that the U.S. wouldn't be bullied by terrorism.
It was a decision that was controversial then.
And people still debate it today. Did the U.S. send the right message? Did it actually make those behind the attack bolder? Target Beirut brings up these tough questions. It doesn't give you easy answers. It wants you to really think about how complex this decision was.
The book also digs into the investigations that happened afterwards,
Both the Long Commission, appointed by Reagan,
and a separate Pentagon inquiry.
they both found that there were some serious security failures that led to the bombing.
They criticized the Marines' rules of engagement
The lack of good intelligence.
and how vulnerable the compound was.
Colonel Garrity, the commander on the ground, he was under a lot of scrutiny for those failures.
He was eventually relieved of his command.
But it's important to note that Target Beirut doesn't just paint him as incompetent,
It shows him as a dedicated officer.
stuck in an incredibly difficult situation.
The book acknowledges that the Marines were up against a whole new type of enemy, a new way of fighting.
They were trying to adapt to a threat that was always changing, something the U.S. military as a whole was still trying to figure out.
And as the book makes clear, the threat of terrorism didn't go away when they pulled out of Beirut. The attack on the Marine Barracks was a real wake-up call for the U.S. It was a stark reminder of the dangers they would face for years to come.
So looking back, what is a lasting legacy of Beirut in 1983? What can we learn from this tragedy?
I think it's a story about how complex American power really is. It shows how hard it is to use military force to achieve political goals, the dangers of underestimating your enemy, and the human cost of conflict, something that never really goes away.
It's also a story about how brave and resilient the Marines who served in Beirut were. Target Beirut honors their sacrifices and reminds us that their story needs to be told.
That's what makes Target Beirut such a gripping read. It's a carefully researched account of a key moment in history, but it's also a deeply human story. It stays with you long after you've finished it.
If you want to learn more about this incredible story, we really recommend checking out Target Beirut by Jack Carr and James M. Scott. There's an affiliate link in the episode description.
Until next time.
Stay curious.